The new Monster Manual is the last of the new D&D rulebooks to be released, and as a certified monster fan, I have been waiting for it impatiently. It comes out in about 2 weeks on February 18th, but Wizards of the Coast sent me an early digital copy, so naturally I found a little time to read it while still maintaining a healthy, balanced lifestyle. All the opinions I've voiced in this video are my own, and this video is not sponsored by Wizards of the Coast. I think the biggest changes to the book fall into 3 categories. Obviously, there are a bunch of new monsters, more than 80, and almost every existing monster has been updated, but they've also changed the whole structure and organization of the book, and they've made some adjustments to the way that stat blocks work. We're gonna go over all of it in exhaustive detail, consider yourself warned, so you can decide whether or not you want to check out the book for yourself. Also, they've done something interesting with monster gender in this book, but we'll get to the birds and the beholders later, because I forgot how creaky this dress is. I'm gonna go change into something less gelatinous and then we'll talk structure. What? I just said less gelatinous. Before we get into the content of the book, we gotta touch on how it's organized. And that might sound boring, but from what I've seen so far, it's actually been kind of controversial. That's how you can tell we're nerds, because we're arguing over a textbook's table of contents. In case you need a quick refresher, the 2014 Monster Manual was laid out in an order that I would call semi-alphabetical. It starts with Aarakocra and ends with zombie, just like we learned in fantasy preschool. But any group that has multiple monsters, such as giants or demons or lycanthropes, is alphabetized by its category, which means that if you want to find a werewolf stat block, you need to go to the L's, obviously. On top of that, the table of contents at the front of the book doesn't list the monsters that are in each category. So let's say that you don't know what a goristro is, and your best guess is that it's a brand of Italian food.
Hey, was that the pizza delivery?
It's not delivery, it's goristro. Well, goristro is not listed anywhere in the table of contents, so you'll have to flip all the way to the back of the book and find it in the index in order to locate it in the D section, for demon. Of course, it's not just monsters in the Monster Manual. The 2014 edition has 2 other short sections at the back, NPCs and miscellaneous creatures. The NPC section has stat blocks like Acolyte, Guard, Bandit, you know, the kinds of characters where you introduce them in passing for flavor, and then your players need to know each one's full name and life story. No? Just my party? Great. The introduction says you can apply racial traits for any humanoid to these NPC stat blocks, so you can make your acolyte a dwarf, or your cultist a Goliath, or your bandit a tabaxi. You know, a cat burglar. Stop booing. I said stop! But despite that, the book seems unsure about whether some humanoids are NPCs or monsters. There are stat blocks for drow and orcs and deep gnomes in the monster section, races that were already playable when this book came out. This is obviously a remnant of early versions of the game, where drow, for example, could only be evil. But that was then, this is now, and we've learned that dark skin does not make an elf evil. The only thing that makes an elf evil is being taken by the dark powers, tortured and mutilated, a ruined and terrible form of life. And now, perfected. I also have no idea how they were deciding which stat blocks belonged in the miscellaneous creatures section. It's mostly beasts, but it also includes things like awakened trees, and it's not about alignment either, because good creatures like pixies and unicorns are in the monster section, while evil ones like winter wolves and wargs are here. Basically, these 2 sections aren't completely useless, but we could survive just fine without them. Guess the writers took the word appendix literally. Of course, none of these things make the 2014 Monster Manual unusable, but they're definitely inconvenient, which is why the 2024 Monster Manual has done a little rearranging. In the new book, everything is alphabetical and NPCs are mixed in with the monsters. You can now find werewolf in the W's and goristro in the G's. All is right with the world. Some creatures have been renamed to keep them close to each other. So now a duodrone is called a modron duodrone, and a tridrone is called a modron tridrone, so that all the modrons are grouped together in the book. That is a tongue twister. They've gotten rid of the drow and orc and deep gnome stat blocks, so it looks like they're not doing monster stat blocks for playable races anymore. Oh, except for Githyanki and Aarakocra and Centaur. And a bunch more, honestly. It seems like if you're from Monsters of the Multiverse, you're still fair game. I do think having NPC stat blocks in their own section was convenient, but I also get why they've mixed them in with the monsters for this book. Separating them introduces questions of where the line is between monster and NPC. Like, should a centaur be an NPC? They're not humanoid, but they are playable. And if you make centaurs NPCs, then why not goblins? Why not harpies? By grouping them all together, you're eliminating that division and basically saying how you use these creatures is entirely up to you. The only separate category of stat blocks is the animals appendix, which is just all the beasts. This is one of those I can't believe they didn't do this earlier things. Obviously, druid players need a concise, collected list of all the creatures that they can wild shape into. 10 out of 10, no notes. There's also a new appendix called monster lists, and this was sorely needed. Guess they should have called it a liver instead of an appendix. Get it? Because you need a liver to... Come on, don't make me pull out the sword again. This section has all the monsters listed by habitat, CR, creature type, and group. So if you're one of the people who's upset that the devils aren't all grouped together anymore, you still have access to that information. You can flip to this section and see a complete list of every devil, even if the stat blocks themselves aren't grouped together. This section also has a little conversion table, so that if you're looking for a specific monster from the 2014 manual that isn't present, you know what to replace it with. Most are just monsters whose names have been changed, although there are a few stat blocks that have been completely eliminated. It's under a dozen total, and we'll talk about that in more depth a little later. I don't know about you guys, but I am constantly using D&D Beyond's filters to sort monsters into lists just like these. The Arctic environment list for when I'm planning a mountain encounter, the challenge rating filter for when I'm choosing minions, and the list of plant type creatures for when I want a monster to hold in my heart and love forever. It's so fundamental to my process, I actually had to double check that the 2014 Monster Manual didn't have a section like this that I had just missed. It seems so obvious, but all they have is this long list of all the environments in the intro with a few suggestions of monsters that might belong in each one. It's not comprehensive, so it's mostly just a waste of space. Speaking of the introduction, it's been cleaned up a little for 2024, but it's mostly just small stuff. They've added a labeled stat block to help new DMs figure out how to read them, and a few sections have been edited and streamlined. The designers have mentioned in some interviews that they added advice for DMs about how to run monsters, but don't get your hopes up about that, it's pretty underwhelming. It's just one sidebar, and it basically boils down to use the monster's abilities as effectively and as frequently as you can. Or, to put it more succinctly, stop pulling your punches, you f***ing coward. Next up, we'll explore the brand new format for stat blocks. We even get a new initialism. I've always thought D&D needed more of those. But first, today's video is sponsored by Hit Point Press and their new adventure book, Humblewood Tales.
Hail and well met!
Wait a second. I'm a D&D character, but what are you?
I'm you, but cuter.
Excuse me?
Oh, it's not personal, but I'm from Humblewood, a campaign setting for 5th edition where you play as cute little woodland creatures. They have a new adventure book, Humblewood Tales. It even has its own comic.
So are your adventures like deliver cupcakes to the turtle tea party or something?
What? You see that I'm carrying a sword, right? Our adventures may be smaller, but they're still intense. We're facing pirate mercenaries, a slime king. We even take on a god of shadow and trickery.
Do you have your own critter-sized monsters?
Oh yeah, Humblewood Tales is over 200 pages, including more than 30 new monsters and NPCs, plus 5 adventures, shops, and magic items, even 3 new subclasses.
Are you off to fight pirates now?
No, I'm actually headed to Alderheart, the Great Tree City. Humblewood Tales includes a travel guide full of expanded lore. I hear you can join a guild and even hunt down Alderheart's most wanted for bounties.
Okay, that sounds way better than whatever I was doing. Want some company?
Sure, check out Humblewood Tales at the link in the description. And while you're there, check out their warehouse moving sale for discounts on all kinds of tabletop stuff. We're gonna need to get you an acorn hat or something before we get to Alderheart. You look ridiculous.
Okay, now that we have thoroughly dissected the table of contents, it's time to look at the actual monsters. The pages should still look super familiar, but they've made a bunch of small changes throughout. We'll use the centaur as an example, both of the new stat blocks and the ideal body. You may not like it, but this is what peak performance looks like. First things first, nearly every creature has art now, and like incredible art. I cannot begin to guess at the small fortune they must have spent on commissioning art for this book. There is so much of it. Every creature now has a little tagline, just a few concise words to tell you what that creature is. For example, bullets are ravenous subsurface land sharks. Centaurs are defenders of the Feywild. I love this as a quick reference, especially for groups of creatures that have different specialties. I've been playing D&D for years, and while of course I know that all fiends majored in evil, I still have trouble remembering if the barbed devil minored in greed or subjugation. I know the pit fiend is the valedictorian though. There's also a listed habitat, the environments where that creature is most likely to be found, and treasure, so you know what kind of items they might have on them, whether that's loot that they drop when they're killed, or even items that your players might be able to steal from them or trade for. So centaurs are most often found in forests, grasslands, or the Feywild. Their treasure could be armaments, which is detailed in the DM's guide as coins, trade bars, and magic items that are useful in battle, or individual, which means they don't have a treasure hoard per se, but they might carry carry a little money for their own use, to buy centaur things. You know, carrots, fancy new horseshoes, designer saddlebags. Also, many creatures, not centaurs, but other ones that I'm not allowed to show you, sorry, have these new rolling tables to generate ideas and make the monsters feel unique. For example, you can roll on a d6 table to figure out the bandit's motivation, like they take only what they need to survive, or they hesitantly serve a villainous leader. Been there, buddy. I worked for Starbucks once. There are also changes within the stat block itself. These are gonna get a little granular, so bear with me, I'll try to make it fast. First, initiative is now conveniently listed at the top. Ability scores now include both modifier and saving throw, which has resulted in this new, kind of oddly pastel-colored table. There's a new line for gear, so you know which items can be taken off the creature's body after it's killed. This is a change from 2014, where the introduction basically said that monsters have no retrievable equipment unless the DM decides to give them some. Next to the challenge rating, every stat block now includes PB, so you know that centaurs get a +2 bonus at Pottery Barn. Just kidding, it's proficiency bonus. Centaurs can't afford Pottery Barn, we've already established they don't have treasure hoards. Also, that nebulous section between skills, languages, etc. and the action section, the spot where inherent abilities like amphibious and pack tactics usually go, that now has a heading. It's called traits. Centaurs don't have that section, you'll just have to trust me. They've made a few changes to their standard language too. This might be something that you don't even notice, but if you, like me, have written your own monsters, that specific wording gets kind of burned into your brain. The new versions are just shorter and easier to skim. For example, if centaurs had this trampling charge feature in 2014, it would have read like this. Each creature whose space the centaur enters must make a DC 14 strength saving throw. On a failed save, the creature takes 7, 1d6 plus 4 bludgeoning damage and is knocked prone. But with the new format, it's much simpler. It just says strength saving throw DC 14. Failure, 7, 1d6 plus 4 bludgeoning damage, and the target has the prone condition.
Why waste time? Say lot word when few word do trick.
There are several tweaks like this to simplify the language used for certain game mechanics. I've been noticing this kind of change in all the updated books. In 2014, the writers had this bad habit of always using full sentences even when it actively made information harder to find. Don't get me wrong, I love full sentences, but they have their place. When you're running combat in D&D, you do not need to be out here reading trampling charge in the style of James Joyce's Ulysses. You just need to be able to find what you need quickly so you can get on with the game. This isn't the next great American novel, it's a reference book. You'll also see this same kind of simplification in the spellcasting monsters. Their spell lists have been moved into the action section, or bonus actions or reactions as the spell demands, and there are no more spell slots. Every spell is either at will or X per day. Unscientifically, just based on the handful of spellcasters that I looked at, there seem to be fewer spells on their lists now. In 2014, the Lich, for example, had 26 spells. 26! In this economy, the new version of the Lich has 15, and honestly, I think that is more than enough. I have never run a combat where a single baddie, even with legendary actions, could realistically use 26 spells. I mean, maybe I'm just not cut out to be a supervillain, but I can't imagine being able to handle a spell list that long while also managing lair actions and commanding my horde of loyal minions. And trust me, I spend a lot of time imagining that. Speaking of lair actions, those have been refined too. A lot of the legendary monsters from 2014, like the Aboleth, the Demi-Lich, or the Beholder, have a long list of extra abilities in addition to the main stat block: lair actions, legendary actions, and regional effects. In interviews, the designers talk about how they've moved lair actions into the stat blocks themselves, and that's kind of true. What they've actually done, when you strip the marketing language away, is this. We'll use the Aboleth as an example. In 2014, the Aboleth got 3 uses per round of its legendary actions, and had 3 legendary actions to choose from. There were also 3 regional effects that applied to the broader area around the lair, and 3 lair actions, which could be activated on initiative count 20. The 2024 Aboleth, on the other hand, has 3 uses per round of its legendary actions, but only 2 legendary actions to choose from. It has 2 regional effects, and finally, instead of lair actions, when the Aboleth is in its lair, it gets 1 extra use of its legendary actions. So you go from 9 different extra abilities to only 4. And this is pretty typical with all the monster lairs that I looked at. I know I have ADHD, and if I try to hold more than 3 things in my mind at once, my brain starts doing an uncanny impression of the "why can't I hold all these limes" guy, but I can't help but think that the 2014 model was a lot to juggle even for a standard issue brain, so I am not at all surprised that they're making some edits. But I know what you're thinking. Ginny, when are you gonna stop droning on about formatting changes and talk about what we all really wanna know? Which monsters I'd kill, which monsters I'd marry, and which monsters I'd... No, that's not what you're waiting on? Oh, you want to know about the new monsters, of course. In the interest of giving you hard data, I let my inner spreadsheet fanatic out to play and I logged every single stat block in both monster manuals. Hey, it was Friday night. A girl's allowed to let loose sometimes. I marked which ones were brand new, which ones had been renamed, and which ones were completely scrapped. Here's what I found. 87 of the stat blocks are brand new, 46 have been renamed, and 11 have been removed altogether. This means we've gone from 427 stat blocks in the 2014 Monster Manual to a whopping 503 in the latest update. Let's dig into that biggest chunk first, the 87 brand new monsters. If you were hoping for a bunch of completely fresh, imaginative new creatures that are unlike anything else in D&D, well, you might want to lower your expectations. Most of these are just new variants on existing creature types. In interviews, they've talked about how their goal with these new variants is to offer more options for different monster types, so you can use them at a wide variety of levels and in interesting combinations. For a lot of monsters, this just means adding a single variant. For example, a Bullet is CR5, but if you want to use one with a low-level party, you now have the new Bullet Pup, which is CR2. Or you can use the pups like minions to beef up a Bullet encounter for a higher level party. Bonus, you get to guilt your players for killing a mom and her babies. Those monsters. There are a ton of examples of this. They've introduced stronger, higher CR versions of the merfolk, the satyr, the pixie, even the violet fungus. And they've done the same for NPC stat blocks, introducing new options like the spy master, the noble prodigy, and the bandit crime lord, proving once and for all that Wizards of the Coast is reading my diary. One thing they seem to have put particular effort into is making sure that there are boss level monsters in most categories. So if you want a construct boss, you now have the CR25 Colossus. If you want an ooze boss, you now have the CR23 Blob of Annihilation. I'm all for this personally. It's all fun and games the first few times you kill Vecna, but play D&D long enough and it starts to lose its shine. For some of the more popular monster categories, just one new variant wasn't enough. Vampires got 3 new stat blocks, including a CR3 Human Familiar and a CR15 Umbral Lord. Goblins gained the Goblin Minion and the Goblin Hexer, bringing them up to 4 options, from CR1/8 to CR3. And this doesn't just mean that you have more to choose from, you can also combine them. The designers have said in interviews that they tried to make sure the options within each group had good synergy when used together. And synergy is what an effective goblin boss needs to really leverage their team's core competencies and streamline operations to align their tactics with key performance indicators. Greasing a staircase is what we in the business call a scalable solution.
Thank McGlubby and it's Friday, right?
In the new list of goblin options, they each fill a specific role. Goblin minions are cowardly and weak, but can appear in huge numbers. Goblin warriors are mischievous and good at setting ambushes and traps. Goblin bosses are strategic and willing to throw their followers under the bus. And goblin hexers are showy and like to cause distraction. And this isn't just my interpretation, these roles are described in the book to inform how you run your encounter. Because it's not just their challenge rating that's different, it's also their roles and strategies, you could easily use all 4 of these stat blocks in a single encounter, and they would all feel distinct. These new variants are also where most of the name changes come in. Since there are now 2 merfolk stat blocks, the regular merfolk has become the merfolk skirmisher, to differentiate it from the merfolk wavebender. Some were renamed in order to ensure that the stat blocks could appear next to each other, like the modrons or the animated objects. And some were renamed out of sheer common sense, like the poisonous snake becoming the venomous snake. This is why we hire copy editors, folks. Of course, not all the new monsters are variants on existing ones. There are a handful of truly new creatures, like the Animal Lords, which are celestial guardians of beasts. They are completely... no? Not new? Oh, turns out they're from 1st edition. Okay, well, what about the larvae? When a soul is condemned to the lower planes, it... also 1st edition. Well, the new CR16 Gulthias Blight is new, a big old plant boss, even though the Gulthias tree has been the source of blights in lore since 3.5, but it didn't have a stat block until now. Wait, I've got one. The Elemental Cataclysm, a CR22 elemental boss monster. See? So there's one. I know I'm being sassy, but honestly, a lot of these variant monsters are unique enough from their related stat blocks that they still feel new. Like, yes, the Graveyard Revenant is a play on the Revenant, but it's also a mass of corpses operating as a single undead creature. It's definitely distinct from the regular old Revenant. The Troll Limb is literally a severed troll limb that can still move and attack and even eventually regenerate into an entire troll. Which doesn't seem quite fair, honestly. A D&D party cuts off a troll's arm and they get a fun 2-stage combat encounter. I do it and I'm told that I'm overreacting to YouTube comments. All I'm saying is it's a lot harder to talk shit online if you have 5 fewer fingers to type with. Anyway, just because a lot of these monsters have familiar aspects doesn't mean that they're not creative. I'm just saying that if what you're looking for is never before seen monsters, you're not gonna find anybody reinventing the warg here. This book is more focused on expanding the 2014 Monster Manual's offerings to fill whatever gaps it had. Also, I'm not being quite fair here because I'm leaving out NPCs. There are actually a ton of those. 23 of the new stat blocks are NPCs. Not just the higher level variants like the guard captain or the archpriest, but also whole new categories like performers and pirates, each of which includes 3 stat blocks ranging from CR1/2 to CR12. Finally, your bard can duel someone who actually understands the craft, instead of just another guy with a sword who claps on 1 and 3. It feels like they were really paying attention to the major fantasy archetypes that weren't covered in 2014. They also paid special attention to cultists, adding 5 new stat blocks to the previous books too. The CR10 cultist Hierophant, as well as a CR8 stat block in 4 exciting new flavors: Aberrant cultist, Death cultist, Elemental cultist, and Fiend cultist. A cultist for every occasion. Of course, existing monsters have been polished up as well. Most are just minor changes, what I would call an edit, usually to make them stronger, simpler, or both. Like the Ghast. Everything about the stat block is identical except that it no longer has resistance to turn undead, and its bite attack hits a little harder. Some have new abilities, like the Aboleth's Consume Memories, which deals psychic damage to targets that are charmed or grappled, or adjusted abilities, like the Helmed Horror's Arcane Sword, which now deals force damage alongside slashing. Several have had abilities cut in order to simplify their stat block, like the Harpy, which no longer has a club attack. Guess she's decided to focus on her singing career. A few creatures have also had their type changed. In interviews, the designers have said that this is either to better align the creature with its lore or set up how they plan to use this creature going forward. So goblinoids are now considered fae, for example. A few of the giant beasts are now celestials, but not all of them, weirdly. Even if these decisions were made for lore reasons, they also obviously affect how these creatures play. If a goblin is no longer humanoid, then you can't use Hold Person on it. If a giant eagle is no longer a beast, then druids can't wild shape into it. Devastating news for my party, honestly. We treat our druid like a private jet. There aren't a ton of these changes, but there are enough that experienced players and DMs will need to pay special attention to creature types as they adjust to the changes. Oh, and don't panic about those 11 monsters that were removed from this book. All of them were humanoid races that are now being folded into the NPC stat blocks. So there's no more orc stat block because you can just apply orc racial traits to a commoner or a noble or whatever kind of orc you need. Okay, we've covered most of the changes, but there is one more change that we haven't really touched on yet. That's right, it's time to talk about monster sex. No, not like that. I'm talking about the way that the Monster Manual handles gender. Some of the stat blocks that have undergone the biggest changes are the ones that in 2014 were explicitly gendered. For example, the Androsphinx and the Gynosphinx. You know, the masculine sphinx and the sphinx you see annually for a pelvic exam. The Androsphinx is described as having the head of a humanoid man, while the Gynosphinx has the head of a humanoid woman, although weirdly, the official art didn't have humanoid heads at all. The two stat blocks are very similar, except that the Androsphinx is much stronger and much louder. I don't need to make that joke, I think you can fill it in. In the 2024 Monster Manual, the conversion table directs us to replace the Androsphinx with the new Sphinx of Valor, and replace the Gynosphinx with the new Sphinx of Lore. There are also 2 new kinds of sphinxes, and none of them have humanoid heads or a defined gender. I don't know how we're expected to carry on without knowing whether the giant winged lion with staggering cosmic power is a boy or a girl, but I'm sure together we'll find a way. The Incubus and Succubus have received a similar redefinition. While they used to be masculine and feminine versions of the same creature, they have now been split into 2 separate stat blocks, neither of which is limited to the masculine or the feminine. The Incubus is a fiend that specifically preys on a mortal's dreams, while the Succubus exploits their waking desires. Just like the 2014 version, incubi can transform into succubi and vice versa, but now you can be a feminine incubus or a masculine succubus. In fact, the art for both creatures shows both masculine and feminine sexy fiends. What a time to be alive, honestly. We see similar choices for creatures that have historically been described as being universally female or male. Satyrs are no longer described as being stout male humans with furry lower bodies of goats, and banshees are no longer described as being formed from the spirit of a female elf. Tons of creatures that are typically assumed to be male or female have art that very intentionally pushes back on that. Pixies, dryads, hags, and harpies all have art that includes both masculine and feminine representations. Now, I know there are people who are ready to poop themselves because the made-up tree lady can also be a made-up tree guy now, and thoughts and prayers, I guess. But honestly, I'm not really that interested in those people. Some will claim that they are defending accuracy, but I hate to break it to you, these creatures aren't real. We made them up, and the people who made them up held a lot of beliefs about gender that are reflected in their writings and stories. We aren't trapped by whatever the people before us made up. We can rewrite our fantasy to reflect our current values. Anyway, from a practical perspective, this also puts more tools into a DM's tool belt. Experienced players who are suspicious of any old lady are going to be very surprised when they end up face to face with their first male hag. Your harpies can now add bass and tenor to their vocal arrangements. Gender was just an unnecessary restriction to place on some specific monsters, and removing it allows for more creativity and less repetitive games. And if the thought of a male dryad makes you uncontrollably vomit, then you don't have to use them at your table, but you should probably also see a doctor. Going into this, I didn't expect to have that much to say, because my memory of the 2014 Monster Manual is that it was fine. Sure, it had room for improvements, but I didn't have a laundry list of complaints about it the way that I did with the Dungeon Master's Guide. But in the process of putting together this video, I realized that the main reason I didn't have complaints about the Monster Manual is that I just wasn't using it that much. When I did crack it open, it was to look at a specific monster that I already had in mind, but when I wanted to build encounters or brainstorm, I tended to go elsewhere. The changes in the 2024 version are all individually pretty small, but I feel like they result in a book that just makes more sense. They've filled in a lot of gaps, so no matter what level my party is and what environment or creature type I'm looking for, I feel like I'll be able to find something that works. Even though Jeremy Crawford did explicitly say in an interview, there will always be more fiends than plants, because he hates me and wants to ruin my life. I would argue that this is probably the least important book to buy out of the 3 new rulebooks, especially if you're confident about encounter balance or if you already homebrewed a lot of monsters. But if you're planning on having your players switch to 2024 builds, you will definitely find it easier to challenge them with these new, stronger monsters. The biggest downside of this book is that, just like the other books, they've really cut down on lore. From the interviews, it sounds like the designers are leaning more towards letting game masters establish their own lore, but I know there are people who are really going to miss the depth of story that the 2014 Monster Manual had for each creature. Most stat blocks now just have 1 or 2 paragraphs of description, and it's centered more on the creature's behavior than its origins and history. I know there were also people who were hoping that the Monster Manual would include more detail about building monsters from scratch, because that was removed from the new Dungeon Master's Guide. Unfortunately, there is nothing like that here. This book is just monsters and lists of monsters, with a few pages up front to teach you how to read stat blocks. If you were waiting for anything more instructional that was missing from the DMG, you can stop holding your breath. The DMG is it. But if you were hoping for a new coat of paint and a tasting menu of different cultists, then I'm sure you'll be thrilled.
Okay, bye.